Well, again, 102, to conclude Chapter 27, we will examine the election of 1968 and the issues that helped Nixon win the election, and we will also put the final assessment on the efforts to preserve non-communist South Vietnam. And as you'll remember, Johnson is really down in the polls, and now his own party is going to seek to take advantage of the dilemma that is the Vietnam War. Senator Eugene McCarthy took advantage of the consternation caused by the Tet Offensive to ramp up his anti-war challenge to Johnson in the Democratic primaries, with anti-war students rallying to his Dump Johnson candidacy. McCarthy polled a stunning 42% of the vote to Johnson's 48% in New Hampshire's March Democratic primary, and it was reported that a dove bites a hawk. Interesting juxtaposition of words. And McCarthy's success convinced Robert F. Kennedy, now a New York senator, to launch his own challenge to Johnson's reelection. Johnson now seemed mortally wounded. He hated Kennedy, dismissing him as a grandstanding little runt. Being challenged for re-election by members of his own party devastated Johnson. The growing opposition to the Vietnam War was an even worse blow. During a private meeting with military leaders, the president acknowledged that the country is demoralized. Most of the press is against us. We have no support for the war. And Johnson had also grown concerned about his own health, and his wife, Lady Bird, told him to think about retiring after one term. So on March 31st, 1968, a haggard and solemn Johnson appeared on national television to announce a limited halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and renewed efforts for a negotiated ceasefire. Then he added a shocking postscript: "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." And as his daughter explained, the agony of Vietnam had engulfed her father. Johnson, a flawed giant overflowing with contradictions, had promised far more than he could accomplish, raising false hopes and stoking violent resentments. And he ended up losing two wars, the one in Vietnam and the one against poverty. Although U.S. troops would remain in Vietnam for 5 more years, the quest for military victory ended with Johnson's presidency. America had tried to fight a limited war in Vietnam, just as they had done in Korea, and that is a flawed strategy when your opponent, in this case the Vietnamese communists, fought an absolute war. And that will be, among other things, the Johnson presidency revealed that the resources of the United States, including its military power, were vast but limited. The nation could not do everything it wanted, which was a disheartening realization for many Americans used to getting their way. And now we go into the election year of 1968, and it is a traumatic year. As Time magazine reported, 1968 was a knife blade that severed past from future. It was one tragic, surprising, and perplexing thing after another. On April 4th, only 4 days after Lyndon Johnson's shocking withdrawal from the presidential race, a white racist named James Earl Ray shot and killed Martin Luther King Jr. as the black leader stood outside the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. And King's murder set off a wave of violence. Riots occurred in over 100 cities, but the damage was especially devastating in Chicago, Baltimore, and Washington. Love was hard to find in 1968 after the Summer of Love of 1967. 2 months after King's death, after midnight on June 6, 1968, Robert Kennedy appeared at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles to celebrate his victory over Senator Eugene McCarthy in the California Democratic presidential primary. Kennedy closed his remarks by pledging that we can end divisions within the United States, end the violence. And after the applause had subsided, Kennedy walked through the kitchen on his way to the press room for interviews. And along the way, a Jordanian Arab named Sirhan, resentful of the senator's strong support of Israel, pulled out her pistol and fired 8 shots, hitting Kennedy in the head and wounding 3 others. Kennedy died the next morning, and it's very strong probability that Robert Kennedy would have won the 1968 presidential election without this tragic occurrence. Only 42 years old and father of 10 children with another on the way, Kennedy was buried beside his brother John in Arlington National Cemetery outside of Washington, D.C. The assassinations of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and John Kennedy came to frame the 60s. With their deaths, a wealth of idealism died too, the idealism that Bobby Kennedy had hoped would put a fragmented America back together again. And a growing number of young people felt orphaned from the political system, having lost the leading voices for real change in the political process. Many of them lost hope in democracy and turned to radicalism and violence. And we will go over that in more detail in the next chapter, 28, on rebellion and reaction in the 1960s and 70s. Back on to the election of 68. The conventions met in Chicago and Miami. In August, delegates gathered inside a Chicago Convention Hall to nominate Johnson's faithful vice president, Hubert H. Humphrey, as the party's contender for the presidency. And imagine there was riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. And they were televised nationwide, giving the impression that the entire city of Chicago was rioting, which was not the case. 3 weeks before, Republicans had gathered in Miami Beach to nominate Richard Nixon. He and the Republicans offered a vision of stability, of law and order that appealed to what Nixon called the silent majority of working class and middle class Americans. And this term that he popularized described the great majority of American voters who did not express their political opinions. They weren't marching in the streets. They weren't protesting and demonstrating against this and that. They were working people, raising their families. And a great deal of the baby boom was still to grow up in this era. And George Wallace was another candidate, the governor of Alabama and the outspoken segregationist. He dismissed both Democrats and Republicans as too liberal. They were owned by the Eastern establishment. And he ran on the American Independent Party ticket, a party he created to defend racial segregation. That's basically his big plank. End civil rights. And Wallace displayed a savage wit on the campaign trail, once saying that the only 4-letter words that hippies do not know were W-O-R-K and S-O-A-P. Nixon resolved to do anything to win the election, including violating the Logan Act, which prohibits citizens from communicating with foreign governments about controversial issues. Just weeks before the voters went to the polls, Nixon ordered one of his aides to monkey wrench President Johnson's last-minute efforts to win a negotiated settlement to the Vietnam War. And when Johnson learned of Tricky Dick, this was his nickname, efforts through Central Intelligence Agency surveillance, he was furious, shouting that the Republican presidential candidate had committed treason. While it remains an open question whether Johnson could have negotiated a deal to end the war before the election, Nixon's most recent biographer concluded that of all Richard Nixon's actions in a lifetime of politics, this was the most reprehensible, for he chose winning an election over the possibility of ending a war he knew was unwinnable. And Nixon was triumphant in 1968. He won most of the states west of the Mississippi, with the exception of Texas and the state of Washington. He won many southern states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Florida. And with his home state, California, that gave him the Electoral College vote. The Democrats splitting their vote, the Deep South states that supported Wallace and the segregationist planks, that's why he got 10 million votes. These states normally vote for Democrats, and that cost the Democratic Party the 1968 election. And this ends chapter 27. Now will President Nixon bring us peace with honor in Vietnam?